You know, I'd like to also address the money in politics thing. There's nothing wrong with money, but the way it's being used in politics is in an anti-democratic way. It's to bribe we have a bribocracy here. And the money is being used to persuade the political figures that we've sent to Washington or Denver or wherever to do things that the people don't want, or to not do things that the people do want. So it's very anti-democratic, and we're so much more aware of that now. Most people want gun control in this country. A majority want same-sex marriages to be legal, and so forth. How many people would be against voting rights for everyone? But the Congress acts like that's not, public opinion is irrelevant because they've been paid to be for this or against that. But we have countervailing force. We don't have to put all of our money in the 4 or 5 largest banks that are too big to jail or too big to fail. We can put them in credit unions, which are much more responsive to community needs and much more likely to lend to small businesses and for constructive purposes. The big banks seem to be interested in being casinos. So if we take our money from Wells Fargo and SunTrust and so forth and put it in the credit unions, that's power. If they don't have money in those casinos, they won't be operating. And that doesn't require an act of Congress. And in fact, there was a big move to move people's money. And billions of dollars were shifted from those big banks to the local banks and the credit unions. There's also a book by Richard Wolff called Democracy at Work. And it's not democracy working, it's democracy at the workplace. There are worker-owned cooperatives. It's a very valid form of organization and can be very competitive with the big corporations that are doing so much damage. And that whole thing is growing. So there's a lot of hope.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on your question too when you talked about, what was different back then than what was going on with the Occupy movements. And I think back then we had common causes. We were marching for better wages for the farm workers. We were marching for land rights in New Mexico. We were marching for education for our children to get not only American history of the Europeans, but the American history of the Native American Indians, of the Mexicans in this country, and everyone who actually helped build this country. And those are the things we marched, and they created a common cause. And nationally, we supported each other nationally. And that's why we could come together as we did in such a massive group. We supported, Martin Luther King's cause, and he supported the Mexican American cause and the Native American cause. Everybody supported the causes because it meant something to everybody. And I think with the Occupy, they couldn't figure out what was the cause. What was the purpose that they were pulling this together? Yeah, it was based on the money that was going into Wall Street, and we all knew that. But they had to create a common cause that would reach out to everybody. And then I think it would have worked if they would have pulled everybody together and made it a big cause, one main focus. And I don't think they did that, and that's why they didn't succeed.
And also, I'll just add to that. Gail mentions they. They didn't do this, or they were unable to do that. Who is they? Whereas, 50 years ago, there were specific leaders who were very charismatic, who had our attention. We didn't have all of these millions of sources of information like we do today. And so we could focus on Jorge Gonzalez, we could focus on Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, whoever was our leader of choice. Whereas today it's so diffuse, and we don't even know who's leading the Occupy movement. But perhaps if we came together and used social media in a way that was more concentrated on specific issues, maybe things would be different.
I think that's interesting, and I want to plug in terms of what worked and what didn't work, because during the time of the March on Washington, etc., and the Freedom Rides, they knew what they were marching for, and they knew what aim they were trying to achieve. All this time later, we don't know why they were marching on Washington. It's just a march on Washington. That whole for jobs and freedom stuff kind of got clipped. It kind of just march on Washington. So I know that it was about jobs and freedom. It was tied to the labor movement, etc. And there were charismatic leaders. What's interesting with the Occupy movement, they made a conscious choice not to have an identified leader. As a tactical move, now we have to say, did that work or not? Because when they wanted to negotiate with the leaders here in Denver, the movement put a dog up. Remember, they said, this is the dog, this is our leader. So they were using it as a tactical piece to say, you can't just knock off one of our leaders like you did in the past where you killed the leader and the movement failed. So I think that's what we have to wrestle with. Did the strategy or did the tactic that they employed work?
I think too, it's the hierarchy of not wanting to have a leader to say like this is the person that is the identifier of our entire movement. And I kind of feel just as a generational piece even, and not speaking for like my entire generation, but I feel like there's always this need to get, to push for something. And right now we don't totally know what that is. Like people are like, well, there's inequality and there's this and there's that, but we don't know what we want, we don't know how to get it. And I kind of see this a lot in the Auraria campus. They did a whole community thing or an event that was called Bash Back, which was for the queer community. It was kind of, it wasn't teaching violence, but it was teaching self-defense. And there was a huge thing of like, do we use violence as a tactic to fight back against our oppressors and things like that? And so there's also this, people not knowing whether they should be using violence or not. And I think we saw that in Occupy too, is it wasn't an entirely peaceful movement. And we're seeing a lot of these movements now where they're not entirely peaceful. Like people don't go and just do a sit-in or a love-in, but they're kind of like, well, do we arm ourselves? How do we defend ourselves? Do we, flip over cop cars and things like that? So there's also, people aren't really in the same, I guess, I don't know, not understanding if they want to be violent, if they want to be peaceful, what does that mean? What are they fighting for and what do they want? And how are we going to get that instant gratification that this generation is really seeking, right? If we don't see it right now, have we won? That kind of thing.
Other questions? Claire.
I'm a kindergarten teacher by training. I probably don't need this, but my name's Clara Lou Humphrey. I grew up in California. In 1960, I went to Georgia and stayed for 2 years, but not working with SNCC directly, except in 2 cases. Okay, my question has to do with running all these dates through my head, and I think I just want to further muddle the water, but all the time this was going on, we had mandatory universal draft. I don't know your history, but I'm betting most of the SNCC kids ended up in the military, at least the male ones did. We had the Vietnam War, which of course we had the organization to fight because already nonviolence was sort of an accepted norm in an awful lot of groups. How does that all fit in? The fact that we were waging war and basically in many cases using the same young people that had been part of the whole process, who were very nonviolent in belief systems. And I do think it helped end the war eventually. It would be nice if we had it now, but that's another issue.